Welcome to the future. No, not quite yet. What are we talking about in the future? Well, I chose different words, similar to what we talked about in the beginning. Cash is king versus liquidity, lifestyle versus retirement, the future. And what happens in the future? Or what happens, more appropriately, what happens if you don't have a future? Ouch, what do you mean? Well, guess what could happen? Today, I could walk out the door and, as they say, I could get hit by a bus. Knock on wood, it's not going to happen today, but it could. And am I prepared financially for a life event to happen for both myself, my estate, my family, friends, financial commitments? Am I prepared? Am I prepared for the future? And that's what we're going to cover in this section, and looking at a couple of different things. Temporary versus permanent, tax advantages, and estate planning all around the future, and more specifically, how life insurance can be applied to this section. Temporary versus permanent expenses. What do you mean? Well, let's look at some of the things. Well, actually, it should be easy. Let's pull out that homework that you did. Remember back in lifestyle, we asked you to sit and look at what are your monthly expenses, and guess what you didn't do? You didn't do it. Well, take a minute and do it right now. Put me on pause and go back and do the homework, because there's a reason I asked you to do it. We need it for this section, looking at permanent versus temporary expenses. So now that you've looked at it, now that you filled it in, we can proceed. So here we go. Temporary expenses. What are temporary expenses? Well, your mortgage. It may not seem like it's temporary. It seems like it goes on forever, but at some point it's going to finish. 20 years, 15 years, 10 years, 5 years. Eventually you're going to be done paying your mortgage. It's not something you're going to be paying for the rest of your life. It may feel like it today, but there is going to be light at the end of the tunnel, and eventually that expense is going to drop off. It's a temporary expense. Similarly, your car. Now you may say, well, I'm always going to keep upgrading my car. Every 5 years I get a new car. Well, that may be true. But remember we did the exercise in your lifestyle to say, when I retire, am I still going to spend at the same pace? Maybe you need less. Or hopefully your car gets paid for, and because you're a bit older, you don't drive it as much. Temporary. Children. Well, children are a permanent expense, maybe, but things like education. So I, as an example, I have 2 sons. My one son is 12 today, and my other son is 10. So guess what I still have? I still have a number of years of expenses, including education. But I can move that, I can calculate that forward to say when Liam is, say, 22, his education is going to be done. So 12, 22, 10 years, I have 10 years worth of temporary expenses associated with Liam. Ian, 2 years younger, 2 years longer, so 12 years. At the end of that, or for a fixed amount, that's a temporary expense. So let's, for a simple calculation, remember, good accountants are good because we make numbers simple. So on average, let's say his education costs $50,000. And you're like, for a year? Well, that could be true. But let's stick with me. Let's just use $50,000. I need $50,000 for each son, therefore $100,000. And I need $100,000 for the next 12 years. But after that, I don't need that expense. And therefore, I have $100,000 worth of temporary expenses. That's the idea of temporary. What else are temporary? Well, you decide, because again, you work through that worksheet on your monthly expenses and identify what you think you need to spend on today and you may not need to spend in the future. The 2 big ones really are mortgage and children. Permanent. What's a permanent expense? Well, this isn't your living expenses, because remember, if I'm not living, I'm not going to have these expenses. So it's not food, it's not my cell phone. All those expenses are done because I'm not alive. Remember, this section is actually on life insurance or if I pass away. Permanent is more things that are permanent expenses, like a funeral. What kind of funeral do you want to have? Remember, this is where I go back with my clients to say, dreams, goals, actions. It's not really a dream to die. But remember, there's two things they say. Death and taxes, right? You can't get away from taxes, and you can't get away from a funeral. You can guess what you can do. You can identify what type of funeral you want, and that's a permanent expense. Number one type of permanent expense. Number two is, we just talked about it, death and taxes. Taxes are a permanent expense. Guess what? You've taken this course, 20 years later, you have that opportunity fund, you've built up that lifestyle fund, and guess what the government's going to like? They're going to like the fact that on your death, it triggers estate taxes, capital gains on a second house, all of those things. And guess what your estate's going to have to pay? Income tax. So, as an example, I heard that examples are actually a better way to teach. Let me put one in here. Let's assume you have a cottage. Guess what? I'm going to assume that this example applies specifically in Canada, because those are the rules that I know. But it may apply also in the US, but remember, just check your local tax authority. Here's my example. In Canada, I have my primary residence, my house, and a secondary called a cottage. When my cottage, I bought it with my opportunity fund, I spent $100,000. 20 years later, my $100,000 is now worth $500,000. It increased by $400,000. But because it's not my principal residence, I have to pay tax. So, really, I know it's not a tax course, it's a financial planning course, but let me add a little tax education for you. $400,000, capital gains, 50%, $200,000, I have to pay tax on $200,000. And let's assume, I know it's high, it's probably not 50%, but let's just use 50% because I like simple math. $200,000, 50%, my estate owes $100,000 on the cottage. So remember, I have my two sons. I'm going to just, in my will, I'm going to give the cottage to my two sons. Fantastic. They get to share the cottage, $500,000. But guess what? On my death, guess what they don't have? Because now they have their own family. They don't have $100,000. Well, the taxman doesn't care. The taxman wants his $100,000. So guess what they have to do? They have to sell the family cottage to pay the tax bill. And who wins? The government. But remember, not you, because you've taken this course. So you know the advantages of the difference between a temporary expense and a permanent expense. And taxes are a permanent expense. And therefore, guess what I have in this course? A solution. And that solution is going to come in the next lecture on insurance. Welcome to the next section on insurance. And I left you with a little cliffhanger there, remember? Because we were talking about that tax calculation on the cottage. Do I need to refresh you? Really quick. $500,000 cottage, cost $100,000, capital gain $400,000. I owe 50%, $400,000, $200,000, tax rate 50%. I owe $100,000. And remember, my two boys, guess what they didn't have? The $100,000. So who's going to pay the $100,000? Do I want to sell the cottage? Or, remember, because you're taking this course, and there's a solution to every problem, there's a solution. Insurance, and therefore permanent insurance. If you, or in this case I, were to buy a whole life permanent insurance policy for $100,000 today, I pay my monthly premium, and upon my death, what happens is that policy, the proceeds of the policy, specifically the $100,000, is used to pay the tax man. And guess what we get to keep? The family cottage. I didn't have to give the cottage away, or not necessarily give it away, I didn't have to sell it to pay the tax bill. I used permanent insurance to pay the tax man instead of having to sell the asset. Or I at least have the choice. I like to view it as giving you options. It's your choice. We weren't forced to sell, but I could still sell if the children could still sell if they wanted to. They now have the choice. They can sell the cottage and take the proceeds of the cottage and pay the tax man, or they could just use the proceeds, the cash from the insurance policy, pay the tax man, and keep the cottage. And that's the great thing about insurance. Don't think of it as an expense. It can actually be an investment. But what insurance does is insurance gives you options and choices. Without it, no choice. With insurance, choices. And wouldn't you like to have choices? I certainly sleep more comfortably at night knowing that I have choices, or more specifically, my family and my estate has choices that I've given them through the use of insurance. And insurance, monthly premiums, are a lot less expensive than you think. And that's the importance of sitting down with a financial advisor to just do the calculation, figure out what your needs are. The whole point of that opening exercise about temporary versus permanent expenses is figure out how much insurance you need and what type. Don't get your whole amount you need on permanent insurance. It can be a blended. You have insurance for temporary things and get temporary insurance or term insurance. If you have a need for permanent things, get permanent insurance and have 2 separate policies. You can actually have 3 policies. You can have multiple policies. You don't necessarily need 1 policy. The key is don't over-insure, don't have too much insurance, but if you can afford it, don't have too little or no insurance. It's that right blend, and that's why you work with a financial advisor. My job is to work with my clients to do that calculation together with them based on the current situations. And guess what happens? Things change. And that's why, guess what? On average, the average person is actually going to buy 5 to 7 times insurance. Not 7 times the amount of insurance. They're going to buy insurance 5 to 7 times in their lifetime. You're going to buy insurance when you're 30, 40, 50, because guess what? Things change. Your financial commitments change. Some you add some, you take away some. The key is to have that financial advisor, that expert. Remember we talked about the car mechanic, the dentist, financial advisor, and meet with them on an annual basis and do an annual review. Okay, guess what? I don't know your numbers, and that's why we sit down together on a monthly basis. And this is why I'm not going to get into too much specifics around insurance, but just to understand, insurance is a solution to a need. What are your needs? And if you have needs, then guess what? It's time for you to seek out an expert or a financial advisor. Or if you're not quite sure, remember we have the Q&A section down here at the bottom. Ask your question. I'll give you an answer. And hopefully based on that answer, you'll know whether you need insurance or not. And then simply based on that, you're going in the right direction. You're making a choice. Remember, it's nice to have choices. And guess what? It's your choice. It was your choice to take this course. It's your choice to actually act on this advice. Fantastic. You made it through section 5, all about the future.